In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in a period of decline. In World War I, it allied itself with Germany and ended up losing that war. As a consequence, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, was occupied by the victorious European powers, Britain and France, and part of that occupation was to enforce the division of former Ottoman territories, in a sense, as the spoils of war. The period between 1918, when the war ends, and 1923 is a period of British and French occupation, and that, in a sense, marks the transition between empire and republic, and is the focus of what I'll be talking about today in terms of colonialism, nationalism, and cultural revolution. There are a couple of interesting events that happened in the context of that occupation that are useful to think about. One is the proclamation of Wilson's 14 points, which underscores this idea of national self-determination. So a lot of the various groups, this is a multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-confessional territory, are advocating for their own sovereignty at this moment. The Ottoman capital city, Istanbul, as well as the empire writ large, were very diverse territories. They had a variety of ethnicities, including Turks, Jews, Kurds, Armenians. There was a variety of religions represented, Orthodox Greeks, Muslims, some Alevi and Shia groups, in addition to Catholics. There was a multiplicity of languages that were spoken throughout the territory. The colonial powers, essentially Britain and France, are a little bit more interested in establishing their own spheres of influence in the region. And because of this kind of contestation between local nationalism and a more colonial vision, there is a compromise solution about how governance might happen in the region, and that is through something called the Mandate. And the Mandate is articulated in the League of Nations Covenant around this time in 1920. The idea of the Mandate is sort of a concept in international law whereby new states would be guided by established, in this case, European colonial states for a period of time until they could establish themselves in the modern world. The Mandate is essentially an idea that negotiates between nationalism and colonialism. It's meant to both acknowledge the aims of more established powers as well as the desire for sovereignty of these new nation states. The issue with the Mandate is that it doesn't specify any endpoint. So the modern Middle East is established really through the concept of mandates largely given to Britain and France. In the case of Turkey, there was an armed resistance to this British and French colonial presence, which led to further negotiations about the borders of modern Turkey. So there are two treaties that are significant here that I think will help illuminate this concept of this contestation between colonialism and nationalism. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 divides the Ottoman Empire into a series of nation states, including independent nation states for the Kurds, that is at Kurdistan, as well as a larger state for Armenia. The issue that arose with the Treaty of Sèvres is that the Turks felt like it was unfair to them. Of course, they were defeated in World War I, and in some measure it was punitive towards the Turks, but they responded through a kind of armed insurrection, a sort of rebellion that became a kind of war of independence. That lasted 3 years. In that time, because they were successful on the battlefields, they were able to renegotiate the Treaty of Sèvres. And that led to the promulgation of the Treaty of Lausanne. The Treaty of Lausanne restores some more territory to the Turks. It also agrees to the inclusion of Istanbul into the Republic of Turkey. It acknowledges the self-determination of the Turkish Muslim component. It denies the self-determination of Kurds and Armenians at that moment. So depending on how you're looking at the particular events in that particular treaty or the series of treaties, they represent a very contested history in terms of the division of former Ottoman territories. The Treaty of Lausanne established the Republic of Turkey in 1923. The founding president of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, then initiated a 15-year social engineering program, which is referred to as the Turkish Cultural Revolution. One of the first things he did was to move the capital city from Istanbul to Ankara as part of this secularizing and nationalizing program. The Turkish Cultural Revolution is a fascinating historical period for what it attempts to do in a very short time. The Turks believed that in order to modernize, they had to emulate Europe. Even if there were no Europeans present, even if there was no longer any occupation, the belief was that they had to still follow a certain mindset. And that's really what informs the Turkish Cultural Revolution. So among the things that were done at that point, one was the changing of the alphabet. The Ottoman alphabet is a modified Arabic script that includes a lot of Persian and Arabic vocabulary. That script was Latinized, so in a sense, symbolically, it would be more recognizable as being Western as opposed to Eastern or Islamic. A lot of the vocabulary that was Persian and Arabic was removed from the alphabet, and new words, neologisms, that had a Turkish or Turkic origin were introduced. And the idea there was that the language should determine a little bit the identity of the people, and that a pure Turkish language would reflect a kind of pure Turkish citizenry. As part of the secularization process, the way people dressed was changed, and men no longer wore the fez, which was the traditional cap that was worn in the Ottoman Empire. Women no longer veiled, but appeared in public without any head covering as part of this push to look and perform modernity. Another example of secularization would be the changes that happened to some monuments, including the Hagia Sophia, which is a famous Byzantine church, and during the Ottoman era was used as a mosque for centuries. In the 1930s, that very historic, important building was turned into a museum in a sense to secularize the space and to indicate the separation between religion or contestations of religion and secular modern life. And the decisions are all top-down. They're never made with a kind of popular support or any kind of referendum. They are decided at a very elite level for the good of the people, and some scholars would say despite the will of the people. And that's what makes that controversial. So even though the British and French occupied the capital city, there's a way in which after they left, they were considered, on one hand, the enemy. On the other hand, they were still considered the model to follow in terms of modernization. And it's that logic that informed the Turkish Cultural Revolution. And it's a bit of a paradox, in a sense, to consider Europe the enemy and the model. But in the case of Turkey, it makes a lot of sense and it informs this particular historical moment.